Hi, everyone. This is Betsy Wurzel, your host of Chatting with Betsy on Passionate World Talk Radio, where our mantra is to educate, enlighten, and entertain. The views of the guest may not represent those of the station or the host. Folks, you are definitely going to want to listen to my guest today. I have phenomenal guests. Today is no exception. With me today is Professor Omer Bartov, who is an author, a writer, professor, historian. He wrote this wonderful book, The Butterfly and the Axe. And Professor Omer Bartov is also, he's a professor at the Department of Genocide Studies, Holocaust and Genocide Studies in the Department of History at Brown University in Rhode Island. Professor Omer, I want to welcome you to Chatting with Betsy.
Thank you very much for having me.
You are welcome. I'm into book titles, so I'm just going to and covers. So I really like the cover of your book. And even though this is audio, people will see a picture of the book in the blog. So I'm going to start with that. How did you come up with the butterfly and the flowers for the cover?
So this cover is combines a painting by a child that was painted in the Theresienstadt ghetto, where tens of thousands of Jews were incarcerated by the Nazis. So it's part of a series of paintings by children who were incarcerated in that ghetto. And the title for that series was Here There Are No Butterflies, because in the ghetto there were no butterflies. Combined with it is a photograph of a girl. Her name is unknown and her fate is unknown, but a girl who was in the region in which the plot of the book takes place in Galicia. And that's an archival photo that comes from a court proceeding that occurred in West Germany in the 1960s. And so I combined the two in the cover. And the title itself, The Butterfly and the Axe, has to do with the plot of the book, but also, I would say, more generally with the fact that butterflies, as we know, are both beautiful and ephemeral. And I associate them with the girl who is one of the main characters in this book. And axes are work tools that are very common in that area, but that in time of violence are also used for killing human beings. And an axe plays a role in the final scene in the book where a Jewish family is murdered.
Yes, and to me, butterflies represent a rebirth of some sorts.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they were a caterpillar and they bloom into a butterfly. So I think the children, this is only my opinion, to me the children, the innocent children who were slaughtered, they, to me, the butterfly is their rebirth into the afterlife. That's how I look at it. You know, flowers are pretty and springtime, and I believe that they saw that when they died.
Yes,
that's just my opinion.
Yeah, I think this is very true, and you know, we think of butterflies as also being very beautiful creatures,
yes.
very fragile,
yes.
and their lives are short, right? But their beauty is eternal. It never goes away. And so in a sense, it's this, just like children, it's the relationship between being ephemeral, just being there one day and no longer the next, but leaving a stamp of beauty on the world that is part of the world we live in, however cruel and merciless it may be.
Yes. I might as well just warn the audience, I might get verklempt during this interview. This is a subject that's very near and dear to my heart. I personally did not lose anyone in the Holocaust. They might have died as later as a result of it, but it's just very near and dear to me because I am Jewish, and my mom's parents did escape during World War I, but they also were terrorized and fled for their lives. But I want to ask you, I digress, I want to ask you, Professor Omer, how did you come up with the story of this book? And I'll tell you, folks, you have to buy this book because it is a fascinating story that is so heartfelt. But I just want to have you go on and you could tell about how you came up with the story. I know part of it is, fictional, part of it is, your background. So I'd like to hear that.
Yeah,
Thank you.
First of all, thank you for reading the book. The book is a result of a long process. I started thinking about this book several decades ago, but for the last 20 years, I've been doing research for a book of history, which came out in 2018. It's called Anatomy of a Genocide, and it describes the life and death of a Jewish town in Galicia, a Jewish town called Buchach. And that's a town that my mother and her family came from. And when I finished writing that book, I realized that although I'd spent 20 years writing it and researching everything that I could find on that town and the people who lived there, I found literally nothing about my own family that came from there. And most of my family, apart from my mother and her parents and two brothers who went to Palestine in the mid-1930s, most of this extended family was murdered during the Holocaust. But I had no information as to what happened to them, apart from some rumors that were in the family that I heard mostly from my mother as I was growing up and later when I interviewed her. And so I thought it was so, in a sense, this is the fate of so many people of my generation. We know that our families were destroyed, but we know nothing about how that happened, who they were. And in some ways I thought it is so unfair because as a historian, I could not say anything because I could not document it. And so I thought maybe I would try to recreate their lives in imagination based on everything that I know as a historian and insert them into history through my own fictional account. And so in a sense, this book is an attempt to tell what happened to some members of my family that I know had been there and I know were murdered, but to tell their story in a way that could not be documented through archival material that I could not tell as a historian, but as a fiction writer. So this was part of the reason for wanting to write this book. The other one was that I realized that people of my generation and those of, say, second and a half generation, people who are somewhat younger than I am, grew up under the shadow of what happened during the Holocaust without even knowing it, without really thinking about it, that it became part of our own identity, of our own psychology, of our own mentality. And I became very interested in that. How can we confront these sort of shadows that we grew under? How can we come to terms with them? And my thinking was it's one way of doing it, and I had done it myself also as an individual, was to, so to speak, go back to the site of the murder, return to the scene of the crime, and to do it both literally by going to those places and in the imagination, but trying to understand what happened there. And so two main characters in this novel are people of that generation who go back to the scene of the crime and try to understand what happened there. One of them is an Israeli woman who is Jewish, whose family came from there, and the other is a Ukrainian man, although he's British. He grew up in Britain. He was born in Britain, but his family comes from the same village in which that murder had occurred. And together they try to find out what happened, and they find that both the families were involved in that event of murder.
Yes, the way, I'm not a book critic by any means, but the way you put your book together, the story, it was so eye-opening and so heartfelt. First of all, as I told you before I started to record, I'll tell the audience, after I read this book, I found out that my great-grandmother was from this area. But she had left before World War II. But they gave me a connection, I felt, to you, Professor Omer, and that, you know, two people from two different backgrounds, and they're involved in the story, and you see the transgenerational trauma of the Holocaust. Now, even as I'm 65, so I was taught at a young age, and I saw these films at a young age, which gave me trauma just, you know, watching it. I was petrified and nightmares for days. And, you know, being brought up, be proud to be Jewish. If somebody says something to you, you were to fight back. That's what my father used to say. You don't be like, you know, we're not having a Holocaust again. You need to stand up for yourself. Did you face that growing up as, and you lived in Israel, did you have that transgenerational trauma?
Yes, so, you know, I grew up in Israel, which is, I think, very different from post-World War II people of Jewish origin who grew up in the United States or in Europe. And the world that I grew up in, and I was born, I'm only a few years older than you are, I'm 69. So the world that I grew up in Israel at the time was filled with the Holocaust. I mean, the people around me came mostly from Europe. And there were many people in the market, on the street, on the beach who had, you could see that they had tattooed numbers on their forearms. Children who went to school with me reported on their parents screaming at night. So the Holocaust was everywhere in that sense. But the education that we received was a very robust Zionist education. It was that this will never happen again, and we will, so to speak, plow the earth with one arm and carry a weapon in the other, that we would always fight back. And so, in a sense, it was the event of the Holocaust was all around us, but it was not spoken about. It was not articulated as a traumatic event. It was articulated as, to put it not very generously, as a humiliating event, as an event that we should be ashamed of. And there were only a few people that we were supposed to admire, and those were the people who fought in the Warsaw Ghetto. Those were the rebels. But we were sort of told all those other people went like sheep to the slaughter.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And so if you want to think about the traumatic aspect of this, or the transgenerational trauma, it was both the fact that so many people around grew up in homes of survivors or in homes where large families had been wiped out, and at the same time that it was a shameful event. And that, I think, my generation, those born in the 1950s in Israel, have been working through that double post-generational trauma or transgenerational trauma for most of our lives. And in some ways, this is what I'm trying to think about in this book. What effect did that have on us as individuals, faced with this conundrum of a horror that we could not quite understand, but that we were surrounded by the aftermath of, and this kind of rhetoric of both humiliation and resistance of violence, in a sense, that the only way you respond to this is by carrying a gun and fighting others.
Yes, I have told this story, but as what you're talking about, the shame that people had felt because the Jews didn't fight back. My sister, she was in, I think, 6th grade or 7th grade at the time. She got into a fight with a girl that she, was friends with. And her friend called her a dirty Jew, and they fought down in the a park. And my sister got, suspended, had to do stuff after school. And my mother was like, Lori, you don't fight. And my dad was like, no, Harriet, Lori did the right thing. That's what was the problem with 6 million Jews. They didn't fight back. You fight back. So I definitely understand where you're coming from, that there was a shame part to it, because they didn't fight back, but I really don't think they could have fought back, really.
No, of course not. I mean, this
they couldn't.
As I'm saying, this, yeah. I mean, I'm not. Yeah. I don't partake of this view. It is the view that, as a child growing up, I was sort of exposed to,
right.
And I spent much of the rest of my life studying the Holocaust, and it is a completely false view of what actually occurred. There were many people who fought back as much as they could, but they were a small minority and surrounded by people who either were indifferent to them or didn't like them, and exposed to a genocide by the most powerful state in Europe. So they were in no position to resist the way we were told they ought to have.
Right.
So yes, it is a false view, but it was one that was very much part of the education in 1950s, early 1960s Israel, which one can understand. I mean, one can understand why this was the narrative that we were being told, despite the fact that I think many people knew it was false, and that the shame that we were supposed to feel for those people in some ways was actually another way of addressing the fact that the people who had lived in Palestine during the war felt ashamed for not having been able to do anything for their own families in Europe, that they were actually living a relatively comfortable life in Palestine while their families were being slaughtered in Europe. So, if you think about the psychology of it, it's much more complex than the simple narrative of being ashamed of how those people went like sheep to the slaughter. And I'd say that politically this has had this sort of long-term effect in the sense that in some ways this view that there can always be another Holocaust that has remained, and in fact has been enhanced in Israel over the years, can give you license to perpetrate violence on others who have nothing to do with the Holocaust. And so it can serve as a license for violence where violence is not the best way and is not warranted. And there are other ways of dealing with the kind of dilemmas that you're faced with rather than immediately reaching for your gun.
Yes, that's very true. Professor Omer, with regards to not knowing like your family, and there's other many thousands and thousands of people who don't know what happened to their loved ones, and I would think, I mean, to me that would be very frustrating. But given as the Nazis worked, that they would drag people out of houses, shoot them on the street. There's a massive graveyards where they were just shot and thrown in a grave. They weren't taken to the camps; they were just shot, as you know, in the open graves, so that they wouldn't know, or maybe they were murdered by neighbors. It's a very it had to be so, and I don't mean to be trite about this, it had to be so horribly tragic for people who were hiding, like this family in your book, and had to rely on kindness of people and not to be turned in. Because, the people that were hiding the Jews also could be killed for hiding the Jews. And it was like, where does someone turn to even get help? And at that time, I mean, you couldn't trust anybody. Not even your fellow Jews sometimes.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, so we have, I think a lot of us have a sense view of the Holocaust, that it was this kind of case of industrial murder, where the Nazis arrived with the police and put people on trains and sent those trains to extermination camps, and they were killed there, and so their neighbors didn't see anything, and no one was responsible for the whole thing because it was so bureaucratically compartmentalized. But in fact, as you say, and as I also write in this book, about half of the population, of the Jewish population murdered by the Nazis, were killed where they lived. They weren't taken to extermination camps. They were killed in their own cemeteries, in the parks where they used to go with their children, in their schools, on the street. And they were killed in open view of their neighbors because there were no shtetls as we sort of imagined to ourselves. There were these cute little Jewish towns. There weren't such things. All towns were mixed. There were many towns in which the Jews were a majority, or at least a plurality of the population, but there were always other people there. And they had lived side by side for centuries, Jews and Ukrainians and Poles and Lithuanians and Belarusians, Hungarians, Romanians, depending on the region. And at some point, the Jewish part of these towns were killed on the street or in a nearby park or in a nearby forest or ravine. And so it's almost impossible to imagine this kind of daily life of genocide where people are just dragged out of their homes, and often then their neighbors move into their homes. These are usually poor towns, poor regions. Even if your neighbors, your Jewish neighbors, were friends of yours, your children studied in school together, you see them being taken out, you see them or hear them being shot nearby, but then the question arises, so what happens to their property? And often people took it over, even if they felt sorry for those who were killed. But many others participated in one way or another in the killing. At the same time, it is important to understand, and I used a lot of, in my own historical work, and I refer to that a lot also in the novel, I used a lot of testimonies by survivors. Now, almost all the Jews who survived under these conditions survived because somebody helped them, somebody sheltered them. It was really impossible to survive on your own. And for one Jewish person to survive, they usually needed multiple neighbors, Christians, but often not people they knew, just villagers in the forest where they fled to shelter them. And that is also something that we need to remember, that there were people, often forgotten, who have remained nameless, who risked not only their own lives, but the lives of their families to help Jews. Often Jews, they didn't know. And, we need to imagine ourselves, would we have done that, especially if we were not just ourselves, but had responsibility for our own children, for our own spouses, elderly people at home. And so it is, to my mind, a horrifying story, but to say that it's unimaginable, as we often do, defeats the purpose of learning from it. In fact, it is imaginable, and we should be able to imagine that this could happen in our own neighborhoods where we live.
Yes.
We should think about it that way and not just say, okay, that's something that happened a long time ago, people were very different then, but it would never happen here. Yes, it can happen here. It can happen to us. It can happen on our street. And that's one lesson, at least, that I've tried to draw from this. History never repeats itself exactly, but as somebody said, it rhymes. And there are similarities that we should be aware of as we lead our own lives.
Yes. Oh, that is so true. What they would call the righteous Gentiles that helped the Jews. As I remember that when I was watching some of the Oscar Schindler movie, they had the righteous Gentiles that were honored in Israel. I just, I remember my mom in the 1967 war. I remember that. I was 10 years old. And my mom said, if we get kicked out of America, we have Israel to go to. We have somewhere. World War II, they didn't have anywhere. Nobody wanted the Jews. And I went around collecting money for the 1967 war for Israel. I have to ask you, the way anti-Semitism is on the rise now, and Jews were always the scapegoat. And I could actually see another, may not be like the one Hitler did, but as the hatred of people, not just Jews, but other people, or on the uprise. It's kind of frightening to me that this could happen again, that maybe we didn't learn anything from the past.
Yes, for many people of your generation, my generation, and for people like me who've studied, the rise of fascism and Nazism and the war and the Holocaust and other genocides, to see the kind of sentiments that have now returned to the surface is obviously deeply troubling and disconcerting. Again, I think, if you try to think about it analytically, if you try to think, why is this happening again? That's something that is well worth considering. What is it that makes now, again, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, racism, strident nationalism, populism come back? And I think, for me at least, the way to try and understand it is to try and see the roots of it and how can we diffuse this before it becomes ever more prevalent. And whether it was in the period before World War II or it is now, as I understand it, it is usually part of what was called even then a politics of resentment. That there are people who feel, rightly or wrongly, and usually partly rightly and partly wrongly, feel that they were left behind, that they were made promises that were never kept, that they were pushed aside, that they are economically increasingly disenfranchised, that their leaders are lying to them, and so forth. And they become the kind of public that is easily then exposed to that kind of rhetoric of hate. Because the rhetoric of hate always exists. There are always people who will use this kind of terminology, but they need a public. And it's the creation of a larger public that is at the root here, not the fact that there are evil people around. There always are. And so that's it. That's at the root of it. And we see this happening in various ways across the Western world. We see it in America. We see it in Eastern Europe. We see, of course, the horrible war between, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But we see it in France. We see it in Britain. There is a rise, and it's not just a rise of anti-Semitism. It is, as it was in the past, part of a larger phenomenon. Anti-Semitism has its own unique characteristics, I would say, but it usually is part of a larger phenomenon. Fascism, when it came to power, was racist and anti-Semitic and xenophobic. It was all of that. And, of course, then it targets the most vulnerable populations, and at the time, Jews were particularly vulnerable. So, to me, it is, of course, personally always disconcerting. And if you, as an individual, as you say with your sister, or I remember that because I was a child in Britain in the 1960s, and somebody confronting me, and because I had a uniform from a Jewish school that I was then attending, and saying to me, "You filthy Jew," and being shocked just because I came from Israel. I never heard that. So personally, when you encounter this kind of prejudice, this kind of hatred, it's deeply disconcerting. It marks you for life, right? Especially as a child. But at the same time, we can't remain there. We have to try and understand what is it that produces it, that lets this thing grow. And I'm an educator. I've been teaching, I don't know how many thousands of students I've taught over my life. We need to teach. We need to talk with people about this. As pedagogues, as writers, as historians, as politicians, one has to address this constantly. And when we go to the other side, when we think that if we monger some hatred, then we're going to gain politically, then we are, as has happened, as you know, also in this country, then you are letting the demons out, and then it's almost impossible to put them back where they belong.
Yes, and I think, Omer, that, it all starts with, like, people wonder, oh, how did Hitler get into power, and, and have all this power? Why did people follow him? But it was, at a time where Germany was not doing well, and they were recovering from World War I. Of course, they blamed the Jews for losing World War I when Jews fought for Germany in World War I. But just to take a human being and then to keep saying lies about a human being, saying they're vermin, they're, they're this or they're that, they're subhuman, and you say a lie long enough, people start to believe it. So it starts with dehumanizing somebody, a culture, different people, different cultures of people. You hear, oh, they're this, they're that, and that's, I think, how the seeds of hate form. I have to ask you this, Professor, because maybe you would know the answer to this. This has always boggled my mind. Jews have lived in Europe hundreds and hundreds of years. How come they're never considered like Polish or French? Even though they lived in those areas, they were just considered, you're a Jew. You're not a French Jew, you're just a Jew. Why is that?
So, Jews have lived in Europe before there was Europe, right? Jews lived in France before there was France, and in Germany before there was Germany, because they already came to the Roman Empire. There were Jews living in Rome when there was still a Judean kingdom. Rome and Alexandria were the biggest Jewish cities in the world. So Jews were there throughout. And interestingly, when you travel in Europe now, It is when you go to the oldest parts of every city that you would visit, that's where the Jews lived, whether it's in Palermo or it's in Paris, because they were among the original populations of those urban sites. But why did Jews not start being like everybody else? It's a very good question, and it has to be seen from both sides. If Jews had chosen to become part of the rest of the population, let's say what happened with Armenians who were living in the area that my mother came from and your great-grandmother from Galicia, the Armenians who lived there were Christian, and they disappeared as Armenians. They became Poles. So if Jews actually wanted to merge within the Christian population, and that was a continent that was Christian, and until the 18th century, everybody was Christian. Everybody was religious and tied to religion and couldn't think of any other kind of existence, then they would have disappeared as Jews. So the Jews kept themselves to themselves, first of all, because they wanted to retain their own Jewish traditions. People didn't speak in terms of identity then, but they wanted to retain their Jewish communities. And they had a variety of rules and regulations as to not mixing with others. So part of it was very much, Jews could not marry non-Jews. Jews could not eat food that non-Jews ate or even touched. There was a whole world of distinguishing yourself from the rest of the world. And they thought of themselves that way, and that's why they survived throughout 2 millennia in Europe. And not only in Europe, but also in smaller numbers in other parts of the world. The other part of it was, of course, that the Christian society increasingly was worried about the Jewish presence amongst them. So the Jews were economically useful, in fact necessary, but there was a theological prejudice against them because Jews were supposedly, of course, guilty of the death of Christ. But also there was a great deal of socioeconomic resentment of Jews because Jews tended to do somewhat better economically than their surrounding population. And so it came from both sides. In some ways, you could say that this both created long-term anti-Jewish sentiment among Jews and among non-Jews, and a kind of suspicion of Christian populations among Jews. But in another way, this was the key to the survival of Jews, as a religion, as a tradition, as a community. All this changed, of course, from the 18th century on, when Jews started coming out of the ghetto, as one historian called it, and mixing in with the rest of European population. And in fact, the root of modern anti-Semitism in many ways is the fact that Jews started assimilating into their own populations, because then they could no longer be identified so easily as Jews. They shed all their religious clothing, everything that distinguished them as such, and they started looking like everybody else, behaving and speaking the same languages, living in the same neighborhoods, and that created a kind of fear of Jews who had to be unmasked as Jews, and that really is the difference between modern anti-Semitism and this kind of old anti-Jewish prejudice that remained in many societies but changed because of the fact that Jews became part of the societies in which they lived. So that's why it's such a complicated story, and it's not simply one of the longest hatred, as one historian called it. It's also a story of a group trying to survive by keeping itself to itself.
Yes, I can definitely understand that. Thank you for explaining that. My mom's parents, who were from Russia. At that time, it was considered Russia. They lived in the little villages, chateaux, as they're called.
Yeah.
And they stayed, amongst themselves. My great-grandfather had a fishing business, so they would mix with, the regular population, the Gentiles, as they referred to the people. But they lived amongst themselves. They even intermarried relatives. Even in America, my mother's side are intermarried with cousins and aunts and uncles. And just to stay married to someone who's Jewish, and it's very interesting. I have to ask you, because I know you wrote other books. They were in Hebrew. How was it writing this book in English? Which is it easier to write in Hebrew, or is it easier to write in English?
Well, I wrote most of my history books, and I've written a dozen of them in English. In fact, all my scholarship I wrote originally in English. I was a child in the United States in the late 50s, early 60s, and I lived in Britain as a teenager. So, I write. In some ways, writing scholarship for me is, I don't know if easier, but as easy as writing in Hebrew. Fiction is somewhat different. So I published 2 novels in Hebrew in the 1980s. Before I came to this country, I came to the U.S. in 1989, and I published 2 novels in Hebrew in the 1980s. And this one is the first that I've written a work of fiction in English. It was a very interesting experience for me because writing it in English, I was using a language that no one spoke in the areas in which I was writing about. That is, people spoke many languages there, Yiddish, some New Hebrew, Polish, Ukrainian, Russian, German, but not English. And so it gave me a kind of remove that I needed to imagine it from a distance, to both be it's a very intimate book, I think. It's very much written from the inside of the characters, but I needed some distance from it. And English was a good tool for that. But I should admit that I then also wrote it in Hebrew. And it's actually just come out also in Israel in Hebrew. And as I said to someone, I translated it into the original language. So in some ways, it was written both in English and in Hebrew at different times.
Wow, you are one amazing man. I'll tell you that. To write in 2 different languages, that's mind-boggling to me. I have enough trouble writing a sentence in English. What is your writing process like when you do a story, Omer? Did you have these characters already in your head and then built a story around them? Because your dialogue, it's amazing. And I don't want to give a lot away of the book because I want people to buy the book, and because it's such a part of history. And this, it might be a fiction book, but these events happened. They definitely happened. But I would like to know about your writing process. I like to ask all the different writers that come on how they come up with their characters and the story and dialogue. It's amazing to me.
Yeah, it's a very strange process, I must say, and I'm always dumbfounded myself, right? Because you don't know how this is going to happen. So I had, in some ways, I started thinking about this book, and I say that at the end of the book, many years ago, decades ago, in the 1980s, before I knew much about that region. And then I put it aside and I wrote books of history and read a lot about that place in which the novel takes place. And 2 years ago, I thought, okay, I should try and write it. And I remember it was sort of funny because I told my wife, the semester is coming to an end. I'll take a week off, and then I'm going to try and write it. And she said, why do you need to take a week off? Just, start tomorrow. And so I got up at 4 a.m. the next day, and I sat down, and I wrote the whole thing, the first draft, in 3 weeks. I completely became absorbed in it. I couldn't stop writing. And so I think a lot of it was already in the back of my mind. And as I was writing it, character after character came into life. I had very vague ideas about them, and as I began writing them, they just sprang into being. And at the end of those 3 weeks, I had this draft. I then thought about it, and my wife and I went someplace. She's a professor of literature, so she's my best advisor, among other things. And we talked a bit about it, and I wrote a second draft, but I was really just fleshing out the characters a bit more. So in a sense, all of it was in the back of my mind already, and it's very hard to describe this process because it's so surprising that you sit down and, it's still dark outside, and you look at your screen and you just start typing, and there is something that is speaking to you. And there were very few moments that I had to stop and say, okay, now what happens now? It just was there. Now, I think part of it is because, as you know, in the book, there are various kinds of documents. There are diaries, there are confessions, there are testimonies, and I've spent decades reading such materials, so I know exactly what they sound like. They echo in my mind. And so the form was there. What I needed to put into that form was the content that was the story of this particular book. And so in that sense, I had already done all the so-called research, all the work before. But the spirit of it was somehow just would come to me every morning. And I'm still, I still miss those days, because it was, in some ways, although the book is not necessarily a happy book, it was a very creative moment for me.
Well, I'm glad you wrote this book. I think it should be read by everyone, and I tell you, Professor Omer, just speaking to you, I think all your students are so privileged to be taught by you, because I could just tell you must be an amazing educator, a professor, and in the area of what you do. You have a very strong connection to the Ukraine because your mom is from that area, and I usually don't ask about politics, but I will ask you this. Excuse me. How do you feel about what's going on in the Ukraine?
No, it's really devastating. Last year I was teaching a class, and it had to do with the World War II, the Holocaust, and I was showing this map, and I was telling my students, a year ago, you would not have known the names of any of these places. I know them because I've studied them and traveled there, but why would American students know about them? And now you do know about them. So all these sites that are now being destroyed in the war, sites that had already been in a devastating war and genocide in World War II. And so to see this happening again, first of all, it's just heartbreaking. My own, if you ask for my, political view on this, Russia under Putin is basically trying to put together again something between the Soviet Union and the Russian Empire, and for Putin and people of his ilk, Russia cannot be Russia without Ukraine. Ukraine, on the other hand, has been trying to be an independent entity for several hundreds of years, and Ukrainians do not want to, and rightly so, do not want to be under Russian rule again. They were happy to live next to Russia, but not to be ruled by it. And so they have to defend themselves, and I'm glad that the West, and especially the United States, are helping them. It's a very precarious time. It's terrifying, but to let Putin get away with this only means if he succeeds in Ukraine, then he's moving on. Then he's moving on to the Baltic countries, which were under Russian and then Soviet rule. Before the fall of the Soviet Union, he is moving to Poland because Poland was once under Russian rule. He will not stop if he's not stopped. And so both because we should protect the independence of Ukraine and because of the danger that he poses to the rest of the world, we have to support this, the Ukrainians. I will say that I was very critical of Ukraine, and I actually wrote a book about it in 2007. Ukraine had great difficulty facing up to its own past. And as occurs in this novel, and as I wrote in my scholarship, there were many Ukrainians who participated in the murder of Jews, especially in West Ukraine. And who collaborated with the Germans. And Ukraine, independent Ukraine, had a great deal of trouble coming to terms with that very dark past. And I hope that after this war is hopefully over soon, Ukraine will do a better job trying to remember that period and not only glorify those who fought for its independence, but also remember that some of them collaborated with the Germans in trying to rid Ukraine, as they saw it, of the Jews. So that's the sort of other side of it, but it should not stand in the way of defending Ukraine now against this absolutely illegal and outrageous aggression by Russia.
Yes, I think Putin would like to have the Soviet Union back the way it was pre-World War II, or shortly after World War II, I should say, owning all that land. I will ask you this, Professor Omer, since we're near the end. What would you like the readers to take away from the book, The Butterfly and the Axe?
I think this is always a very hard question to answer because obviously what you want your readers to take away from what you write is what they see in the novel, and you don't really want to tell them to interpret.
Yeah, right. That's a good point. You don't want to tell them what to think.
Yeah, but I think if to sort of generalize, in this novel you have two characters. One is of Ukrainian ancestry and one is of a Jewish background. And they, so to speak, come from two different sides of that story. And they, through their quest for trying to understand what is it that marred their own lives, that somehow skewed their own psychology, through that search, they come to the place of violence that had caused that. And there, because they find it together, they find compassion for each other. And for me, this is maybe the most important element, that if you can see the world through another person's eyes, you will find not only compassion for others, but also greater understanding of yourself. And I think this is what ultimately happens in a story, which is, a very tragic story, that some sort of fruit, something beautiful, some butterfly can emerge from that, which has to do with individual compassion and love.
Oh, that is beautiful. Yes, that's true. They, the characters came to understand each other's side and how they were, connected, but what went on in their family's history. I think it's an incredible story, and I thank you for writing it and coming on my show to talk about it. Where can people purchase The Butterfly and the Axe?
Oh, it's available on Amazon. It's available on Barnes & Noble. So it's easily, and it can be purchased as a book or also on Kindle.
Oh, great. And is there a way for people to connect with you, Professor Omer?
Yes. Yes, I have an email address. It's at Brown University. I can give it to you. It's very simple. It's my first name, OMER _ BARTOV at brown.edu.
Okay. I want to thank you so much for coming on, Professor Bartov, and for writing this book. I highly recommend buying this book, folks, The Butterfly and the Axe. It's an incredible story. It's kind of hard to put into words, and but Professor Omer, you nailed it. It's really to see situations and stories and through another person's eyes. That was wonderful, and this book touched my heart deeply. I really felt a connection, and I also liked the little pictures in the book too. To say I love photos, and I just want to thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it, and I hear you are off on a flight soon this week, so you have a safe trip.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. And folks, you know what? I use my phone, which is my mic, to the platform to the world. And we need to stop the hatred. We need to stop these stigmas. And we are more alike than we are different. And I just wish that everybody would put aside their differences and just learn to live with each other and get along, because we all want the same things. We really do. Safety, place to live, food, shelter, a job. We all want these things. So I would like to see more humanity, more brotherhood amongst people. That might be a dream, but that's how I feel. And I want to thank Jeannie White, who's station manager at Pastoral Talk Radio, who writes the blog, produces the show. The information will be in the blog where you can purchase the book and contact Professor Omer Bartov. Excuse me, my voice got hoarse again. And I want to thank Lillian Caldwell, CEO of Passion World Talk Radio, who makes this all possible. And I want to thank you, the audience. Please continue to listen. If you don't already subscribe, please subscribe. It is for free. It's Spotify, Spreaker, YouTube, to name just a few. I can only get the word out about my show and to help people, which is what the show is about, if you all help me. And when you all share the show, you are helping me to not only share the show and to help people, but to honor my husband Matt's life. And my husband Matt is, and was, and always will be my catalyst, my inspiration for all that I do. And as we're coming to June this week, and by the time this is out, it might be almost the middle of June. June is Brain and Alzheimer's Awareness Month. Please consult your primary care physician if you have any concerns about your memory. Please talk to your primary care doctor. And I just want to thank you all for listening. And as I always say at the end of my show, in a world where you can be anything, please be kind and shine your light bright. Because if we all did that, it would be a much kinder, brighter world. Oh, and before I forget, if you want to follow me, I'm on Facebook at Betsy, B-E-T-S-Y, initial E, Wurzel, W-U-R-Z-E-L. And if you're looking for a support group, you're a caregiver, chances are you will be one eventually, I have hashtag Kick Alzheimer's Ass Movement on Facebook, and you're all welcome to join. That's it for today. This is Betsy Wurzel, your host of Chatting with Betsy on Passionate World Talk Radio. Bye-bye now.